In the empathy chapter, you mentioned empathy a couple of times here. You take on a rather poignant but difficult topic in this idea of the importance of justice to us as a community, and yet at the same time understanding the immense value of empathy. And those are two things that are we struggling with today, right? Because very easily you can say something that will completely get you removed, just written off, right? And in those people's eyes, they're enacting justice, right? But what you do in that chapter by examining the complex relationship between Job and Yahweh, right, the God, Judeo-Christian God, you did something rather clever that I wasn't expecting, in that you said God is having empathy on Job. And there's a big difference between, because I've heard people say he pities Job. That's not the same thing. Can you talk a little bit about that approach between that relationship and how it helps develop our sense of the importance of empathy today?
Oh, absolutely. And to your earlier point, I mean, justice is incredibly important to us as a species. And justice at its core isn't me getting justice for myself, it's me getting justice for you. And that's what justice is. And we have this innate biological drive when we see something that we perceive as being unfair, when we see another person being hurt, to want to reach out and even sacrifice ourselves, put ourselves in danger to help that other person. And that's an extraordinary and wonderful thing about our species, which allows us to form healthier, happier societies that are more diverse and allow for different kinds of people, as opposed to kind of more militant communities, where justice has to be enforced by a kind of strong arm or an autocrat. So that's an extraordinary, wonderful gift that we have from our brain. But the thing about biology is that everything is about a kind of balance. And you can, in a biological system, have too much of a good thing. If you have too much oxygen, you die. Too much oxygen is not good, And the same thing with justice, there's a limit. And so wonderfully, our brain has evolved this balance to justice, which is the ability to forgive and let go. And none of us would be able to survive in any of our relationships if it wasn't for forgiveness, because all of us do things which, we need to be forgiven for. And the same thing goes not just in our individual relationships, but our social relationships. And unfortunately, yes, we are living in a moment right now where we probably have more justice than empathy. That's gotten a little bit out of whack. Part of the wonderful thing about literature is literature evolved to strengthen our empathy powers, because those powers are weaker in our brains. Our brains incline more to justice than to empathy, because empathy is a later biological development. And so the passage you're talking about in the Hebrew Bible is this extraordinary moment in which the Bible, which has up to that point really emphasized God and justice, shows us this moment of God feeling empathy and forgiveness for Job. And the important thing about forgiveness and empathy is it does not mean condoning the other person. It doesn't mean saying, well, I think you were right. It merely means understanding their perspective and seeing how they got there. And mixed with that too, usually if the person is asking for forgiveness, is a willingness to say they've learned and they won't do that again. And so there's not a need for justice, because the purpose of justice isn't to exact blood. It's not to exact an eye for an eye. It's ultimately to create happier, healthier communities. And so if I can do that without actually taking your eye, but can let go. And so there's this extraordinary moment where, of course, we don't get inside God's psychology, and we can never get inside God's psychology. But we see that God, nevertheless, in that passage, has the capacity for empathy, and that inspires us to say, well, maybe our better selves aren't just, they can be empathetic too.